their old familiar carols play. Wild and sweet, the songs repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And I thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth and goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong will fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Those familiar words come from the popular, haunting, but eventually hopeful Christmas carol based on the 1863 poem of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. As Christmas arrived that year, Longfellow reflected on the promise of Luke chapter 2, which we will consider together in the Christmas Eve service this Tuesday, that again we hope you'll join us for. Peace on earth and goodwill to men. A promise from God. But in Henry's lived experience, that promise was unfulfilled. 2 years earlier, he had lost his deeply beloved wife to a house fire. Civil war had broken out in our nation. Against Henry's wishes, his son Charles had joined the Union Army in March of 1863, only to be returned to Henry severely wounded. The poem includes stanzas we don't sing in the carol, including how the thundering of cannons to the south drowned out the sound of that promise the angels had proclaimed. Longfellow knew the promise of God, but when he considered the situation around him, the promise was unfulfilled, the hope unrealized. And so despair set in. Was the promise of God even true? Would there ever actually be a deliverance? And if so, how in the world would it ever come about? Now, the song and the poem do point to hope. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong will fail, the right prevail. But how? What will be the catalyst that brings about the fulfillment of this seemingly distant promise? And in the song, we're not told. The assurance that God will fulfill his promise does soothe Henry's despair and allows him to end that poem in hope. And we wonder what his response looked like when his hopes were fulfilled in real time. His son was healed. The Civil War came to an end. You see, Longfellow's circumstances, they're one example of the constant human condition, one that we see all around us. War, corruption, deceit, disease, relational trauma, and on and on and on. And if we are honest, we see it in our own hearts as well. Now, as you'll see in the sermon notes on the back of the bulletin, we too find ourselves in a difficult and despairing situation in which we long for deliverance, but if and when we experience that deliverance, how will we respond? And above all, what catalyst could possibly bring it all about? See, that was the experience of Zechariah and Elizabeth in Luke 1, 2,000 years ago. It was the collective experience of all Israel and by extension, the nations. It also happens to be the experience etched in so many of the timeless words we sing in Christmas carols in December of every year. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, which mourns in lonely exile here. Or, O little town of Bethlehem, the hopes and fears of all the years. I encourage you this morning to have your Bible or app open to Luke chapter 1 and your bulletin notes in front of you will be referring to both of them as we move along. First, in the upper left-hand corner of your notes, we're going to talk about Elizabeth and Zechariah's situation. That's found all the way back in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, where we find that they are an upstanding couple, serving God faithfully year after year, yet childless and elderly, unable to have children any longer. So what caused their despair? A dead womb. In verse 13, we learn that Zechariah is still praying for his wife to conceive, even when biologically there was no reason for him to hope that that prayer could ever be answered. He longed for his wife to know the joy of motherhood, to have a child himself, and to see the shame, the disgrace of his wife removed. For at that time it was assumed in that culture as well that a woman who was barren was childless because of some sin on her own part. You can see in verse 25 where Elizabeth references the disgrace she experienced. Yet for all of the obedience and service of this couple, we notice that doubt and disbelief were woven in as well. For God is now promising through the angel Gabriel that he is about to remove their shame, to miraculously deliver them from their despair. And now that he's promised to do so in verse 13, Zechariah immediately responds with disbelief. Verse 18. Now, as a priest, he knew that time and time again in Israel's history, God had brought life to barren wombs. Sarah, Rachel, Hannah, and in each case, the son born to that barren womb was a man set aside by God to do great things. And now that he's being told the same thing is going to happen to him, he doubts. And that doubt was so serious that the angel Gabriel struck him dumb, unable to speak until his son was born. In summary, and in our notes in that upper box, Elizabeth and Zechariah's situation included a dead womb, shame, doubt and disbelief, and unfulfilled hope. That is a dead womb, shame, doubt and disbelief, and unfulfilled hope. Their problem, and this is key, was one that no human action could possibly deliver them from. And that's the background before we get to the text that Tim read for us earlier. What about Elizabeth and Zechariah's deliverance, that next box down? Well, God has met their dead womb with miraculous new life. Romans 4:17 calls our God the God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they are. Barren womb, advanced in years, well beyond the ability to conceive, barely an inconvenience for our God. What he has already done in the past for Abraham and Sarah, setting in motion the entire nation of Israel, he is now doing for Elizabeth and Zechariah, bringing forth their son who will play an even more important role than did the son of Abraham and Sarah. God removed Elizabeth's shame and disgrace and replaced them with his favor. Though Zechariah was disciplined for his unbelief, it's clear that God restored his certainty in God's promise, because the angel told Zechariah that Elizabeth would become pregnant, and he doubted. But the angel also told him the boy's name would be John, which he must have told Elizabeth as well. And now we see that they are both taking the angel at his word. Verse 59, the neighbors and relatives are naming the boy after Zechariah, and Elizabeth is having none of it. Verse 60. The original language here is emphatic, no. Now, some of you, particularly from the 90s, might remember the Dikembe Mutombo finger wag. Some of you are lost right now. It's an NBA player who was the best shot blocker of his era, and he would block a guy's shot, land on the ground, and wag his very long finger in their face to say no. We might think of Elizabeth doing the same thing, except she didn't just block the shot, she swatted it out of the building. So they decide that they're going to try to persuade Zechariah. If Elizabeth won't listen, surely Zechariah will listen to them. But they find that Zechariah, verse 62, is even more emphatic than Elizabeth, verse 63. Elizabeth said he will be called John, will be in the future. And yet Zechariah says his name is John. In fact, the original language is John is his name. It is settled. There will be no discussion. It seems that Zechariah has learned his lesson after 9 months not speaking, and he's now taking the angel at his word. The angel said, Zechariah, Elizabeth will be pregnant. Really? How is that going to be? His name will also be John. Okay, yes, John. Immediately his mouth is opened once again, verse 64. So God meets their unfulfilled hopes, not just by fulfilling them, but fulfilling them in a way that is far beyond anything they could have hoped or imagined. Not just, I will give your wife a son, I will give your wife the son prophesied in the Old Testament that will prepare the way for the Messiah. Wow. So what did they experience in deliverance in that second box? Dead womb to new life, shame to favor, doubt to belief, hope fulfilled. Again, dead womb to new life, shame to favor, doubt to belief, hope fulfilled, and none of it accomplished through human means. Now, Zechariah has been dumbstruck for 9 months, and suddenly he has the ability to speak. What would we expect him to say? What would we have said in his situation? My son, Elizabeth, we have a child. I can finally speak again. It's about time. And yet he doesn't say any of that. No, everything that Zechariah has to say is about what God is going to do for the deliverance of Israel. And when he does eventually talk about his newborn son, more than halfway through the prophecy, it's all in reference to the role John will play in the life of Jesus anyway. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment because where are those kids I talked to earlier? Where are you guys at? All right, some of you are still awake. Great, that was one of my goals this morning. Wonderful. Earlier, I wonder if I owe you an apology for what happened earlier. I asked you who we're going to talk about today. A birth prophesied 2,000 years ago, prophesied in Old Testament books, a birth that would change the world, a pregnancy that couldn't happen. His name starts with a J, and you guys said Jesus, and you were so excited. And I just crushed your excitement and said, no, John. But John, his whole life is actually about Jesus. So kids, do I owe you an apology? All right, well, to the vast majority that said yes, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Israel's situation, the second box on the top. Filled with the Holy Spirit, God himself, Zechariah prophesies. No big deal. Happened in the Old Testament era all the time. Okay, that's true, but there hadn't been a recognized prophet in 400 years, at least not one who spoke scripture. The last time that had happened was Malachi 400 years ago, who it just so happens was prophesying about Zechariah's son John the Baptist. So this was not just some normal occurrence. Rather, this was a surefire, can't miss, neon sign in the sky that God is doing something utterly significant at this moment. But what? What was God doing? And who was in view in what God was now doing? Let's establish that first. Verse 68, Israel, God's people. Verse 69, the house of his servant David. Verse 70, his holy prophets. Verse 72, their fathers. Verse 73, Abraham. No mistaking it, this moment was all about all of Israel and beyond Israel. For God had told Abraham that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him back in Genesis. And this blessing of God, which John was now going to prepare the way for, well, all nations would be blessed through this. For what he was about to usher in, the Messiah, would bring men and women of every tribe, tongue, and nation, the most diverse group of people ever assembled, into God's family both now and forevermore. It was for everyone. And they would be redeemed, saved, rescued. That's the deliverance. But getting ahead of ourselves, delivered from what? What was the situation they needed to be delivered from? Well, initially, if we look at Zechariah's prophecy, they need to be saved from their enemies, from the hand of all who hate them, verse 71. From the hand of those same enemies, verse 74. Okay, so they're under threat. They're hated, they're persecuted, surrounded by those who wish to do them harm. Situation? Well, they needed protection from human enemies. But hold on, not so fast. Because verse 77 states that this situation, or this salvation, would be known to them through the forgiveness of their sin. Not their enemies' sins were going to be dealt with. Their sin was going to be dealt with. And it was going to be dealt with through forgiveness. Back in verse 74 and 75, the purpose of this salvation, this rescue, redemption, deliverance, was to enable them to serve God without fear, in holiness and in righteousness before him all their days. So it was not their physical enemies that were the main obstacle to this service, it was their own sin. This condition of sinfulness, wrongdoing before God, betrayal of his goodness to us, refusal to follow him, to obey him, treachery toward him, treachery toward other people whom he has made in his own image. It's spoken of all throughout the Old Testament. For example, the prophet Ezekiel spoke of the heart of stone that humanity has. And he stated that it needed to become a heart of flesh. A heart that is dead and lifeless must become living and pulsating. And God would yet make that change happen. God promised he would do it. And this prophecy of Zechariah is pointing to the fulfillment of that and many other promises of God. So in your notes, the situation of the people of Israel and the nations as a whole, dead heart, shame for their many sins, which was linked with fear and unholiness and unrighteousness, doubt and disbelief. They've been waiting 400 years for the prophecies of Malachi to be fulfilled, and much longer for prophecies in Isaiah and other books, and all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 to be fulfilled. Would God ever fulfill what he promised? And so they have hope unfulfilled, a dead heart, shame, doubt and disbelief, unfulfilled hope. And their problem was one that no human action could possibly deliver them from. Is this sounding familiar? It's the same situation Zechariah and Elizabeth were in. Their situation, Zechariah and Elizabeth, was a small representation of what Israel and the nations in general were experiencing. So where is their deliverance going to come from? What is it going to look like? God brought new life to the dead womb of Elizabeth and Zechariah, and he's going to bring a new heart, a living, pulsating heart, to the dead heart of stone of the people of Israel and the nations. Their sin, rebellion against God in so many ways, caused shame and guilt. Themes all throughout the Old Testament. And Zechariah's son John will be the signpost, the billboard that points the way to Jesus, who will purchase that forgiveness with his own blood. God will remove that shame and guilt for those who trust in him through the sacrifice of this child that John is preparing the way for. And the knowledge of the salvation they needed will come through and only through that forgiveness purchased for them. Far more than rescue from earthly enemies, God's people needed rescue from their own sin, and so do we. That rescue which had been promised in passages such as Isaiah 53, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. That promise and many others was about to be fulfilled. And the payment for their sin, which would wash them clean, would remove their fear, would allow them to miraculously be counted holy and righteous, though they were not, and therefore able to serve God, who calls things that are not as though they are. Their deliverance, heart of stone to heart of flesh, sins forgiven, doubt to belief, hope fulfilled. That's heart of stone to heart of flesh, sin forgiven, doubt to belief, hope fulfilled, and none of it accomplished through human means. The deliverance must come from outside of themselves. What about response? Well, Elizabeth and Zechariah, after these events, having been delivered from the situation they were in, went on their merry way, lived however they wanted to, and largely ignored God for the remainder of their days. Kids, do you have a problem with what I just said? Is that what Mr. Tim read? Oh, I lost you now. Should have kept you more awake. Yes? Zechariah and Elizabeth. No. That would be strange, wouldn't it? After all God had done for them, they just decided to live their lives, be their best selves. They did them and went on their way. Not at all. What does the text say? Elizabeth was filled with joy, verse 58. Zechariah praised God, verse 64, and experienced the delight the angel had prophesied about back in verse 14. They expressed belief and trust by following the angel's instructions. But this response, it didn't just belong to the parents of John. It was shared with the people around them, the relatives and neighbors. Verse 58 shared Elizabeth's joy. They were filled with awe, verse 65. People were talking about it everywhere in the surrounding area, also verse 65. And they all wondered and were filled with anticipation. What is God going to do through this child? God is up to something. What is it? And everyone was talking about it. Amazing. For your notes, Elizabeth and Zechariah's response was belief and trust, praise, joy, delight, awe, wonder, hope, anticipation, and it was contagious. Everybody else was catching what they had. That belief and trust, that praise, joy, delight, awe, wonder, hope, anticipation. Don't we want to live like that? In spite of the circumstances we find ourselves in, our despair, our temptation, our doubt, and so much more, don't we want to be people characterized by belief, trust, praise, joy, delight, awe, wonder, hope, anticipation? And we're reminded of that at Christmas in particular. What about Israel and the nations? Well, we've already seen that many shared in the response of Elizabeth and Zechariah, but not all. For those who did, their response included serving the Lord all their days without fear and in a position of holiness and righteousness, though they were not so. They were redeemed, forgiven, rescued eventually by what Jesus did for them. Many followed John and were baptized by him. But John, the public figure of all Israel at the time, the number one celebrity, everyone wanted to know what John had to say and what John was doing. He was the talk of the town, and he kept saying, Jesus is more important than me. That carried weight. He kept saying, stop looking at me. Look to him. Look to the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And those who believed John and followed Jesus found everything they needed. The people took notice. You might just circle everything Elizabeth and Zechariah had in response and draw an arrow over to Israel and the nations, but not all of them. Others rejected the deliverance of God. Some experienced all those things, but others experienced disbelief, antagonism, hatred. They rejected deliverance and ignored God. Disbelief, antagonism, hatred, deliverance rejected and ignored. And now we come to us. I haven't given you anything yet to put in that third column, but my guess is, knowing our congregation, there are a few of you who are those goody two-shoes students, and you've already started filling in the notes. That's good. You've already started thinking about, how does this apply to me? What is my situation? What's the deliverance that I need? What is my response to the deliverance I've received, or what would be my response if I received the deliverance I haven't yet received? Can you relate to the situation? Can you relate to feeling lifeless? To knowing there's something missing, that you were made for more? Can you relate to shame, to guilt, to unfulfilled hope, to doubt in the midst of belief, to a mistrust of God? Have you seen your own sin and your need of rescue from all these things? And have you given up hope that any human means could deliver you from all of it? Now, we've yet to talk about the final row at the bottom there, the catalyst that brings about the deliverance. We're almost there. But first, what is a catalyst? Most of you know, but for a few, perhaps for our kids who might not be sure what that word means, it might be easiest to think of a chemistry lab. And the chemist is mixing chemicals together, and he might mix 3 or perhaps 4 chemicals together, and nothing seems to have happened. But then he adds a 5th chemical, and all of a sudden there's this noticeable change of color or smell or an explosion. It was noticeable. There was a change. That's a catalyst. A catalyst causes a change that can't be ignored. What's the catalyst that changed Elizabeth and Zechariah's situation? What's the catalyst that changed Israel and the nation's situation? What is the catalyst that can change our situation? Well, before we get there are 4 groups of people here in the sanctuary this morning and listening online. 4 groups in relation to that catalyst. The first group has experienced the catalyst. You have experienced deliverance from your circumstances, and you are responding with belief, praise, joy, hope, awe, and more. You are experiencing a deliverance far beyond anything that human means could accomplish. Death to life, sin and shame to forgiveness and favor, doubt to belief, hope fulfilled. And if that's you this morning, I pray that this Christmas season would find you reveling in all that God has done for you with an intensity you haven't yet experienced. You'd experience even more than you ever have, and would just be filled with amazing joy and peace. The second group is a group that has experienced the catalyst, but for one reason or another right now, you're not experiencing joy and awe and trust. Perhaps you even wonder if it's really real. And if that's you this morning, I pray that this Christmas season, our God in his goodness would meet you in such a way that assures you that you belong to him, and he would restore you not only to the former joy and awe and hope you had, but to those things in far greater measure, that you may find rest and peace this Christmas. Third is the group that's in the most danger. It's a group that thinks they've experienced the catalyst, and for the record, there is not a single solitary person in my head right now before anybody goes, the pastor's talking about me. I just know in a congregation of our size, there are some of you who think you've experienced the catalyst. But you've gone on your own way. You're doing you. You're living your own life. And the catalyst, like a chemist poured the chemical in and there was no reaction. There's no awe, no wonder, no genuine delight. The salvation of God is just kind of a fact. It's never made a difference in your life. And if that's you this morning and this Christmas season, I pray that God will open your eyes, that you might see the true nature of your own condition, as we all have to do. and that you would be enabled to receive the deliverance he has purchased and truly know all that he has done for you, and that you too would experience his peace ever more deeply, if for the first time. And then that fourth group, the final group, are those who have never experienced the catalyst, and you know it. Oh, we've got good news for you this morning. There is a deliverance that is available to you, a deliverance that goes far deeper than all that you know that you need, that brings life to the dead, forgiveness and favor to sinners, belief to doubters, fulfillment of hope, that calls you who are unholy, holy, that calls you who are unrighteous, righteous, that calls you who are filled with sin, good, even though you know you are not, because through the salvation that Jesus brings, God calls things that are not as though they were. And what matters at the end of the day is how he sees you. And that's available to you. Those of you who have experienced the deliverance of God, the deliverance that no human effort could ever accomplish, can only do so because of the catalyst that is the foundation of it all. And those who have yet to experience will only ever be able to experience it because of the catalyst on which it all rests. And I wonder, do you see it? Have you filled in that bottom row already? It's right there in the text. It's in the beginning in verse 58, shown to Elizabeth. It's in the middle, verse 72, shown to the fathers of Israel. And it's at the end in verse 78. Look at verse 76 through 79. It's all one long sentence. And the entire sentence, everything in it, rests on the tender mercy of our God. Your salvation rests upon that. John was born because of God's mercy. We can know salvation and deliverance because of God's mercy. Our sins can be forgiven only because of God's mercy. Yonder breaks a new and glorious morn because of God's mercy. The light of the rising sun of new life shines on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death because of God's mercy. It's all about his mercy, but to what end? To guide our feet into the path of peace, new life, forgiveness of sin, light in our darkness, peace with God, and so much more, on the basis of God's freely given mercy, a gift that cost him greatly, but is yours for the receiving. For his mercy displayed in all of this is most evidently clearly on display when Jesus, the one John prepared the way for, died in our place on the cross, paid the penalty and price for our sin, and in that way and only that way opens floodgates of the streams of mercy so that you and I might be washed in a torrent of overwhelming forgiveness and renewal. In a word, mercy. Submerged in it, immersed in it, baptized in it, living and breathing in it, a life of mercy. And some of you might wonder, why talk about the cross at Christmas? This pastor is not very smart. That might be true, but he doesn't seem to know that Christmas is about Jesus' birth, not Jesus' death. I went to church this morning, and that pastor seemed to think it was Easter. Guy doesn't even know how to read a calendar. Well, you realize there's no birth to celebrate, if not for the death he came to die. Do you know that Christmas wouldn't exist except that Easter was necessary? Christmas exists because we need to be delivered. Some have wondered, for instance, why is it that all the great music seems to happen at Christmas? Where's all the great Easter music? I mean, there's some of it, but there sure seems to be a lot more great Christmas music than Easter music. And I think I have the answer for you. All the great Easter music, it's already in our Christmas music. Have you noticed it? Oh, holy night at the bottom of your notes. Long lay the world in sin and error pining till he appears and the soul felt its worth. A thrill of hope, weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Silent night, radiant beams from thy holy face with the dawn of redeeming grace. Those lyrics, by the way, are taken right out of that long final sentence in Zechariah's prophecy. And so are portions of the song we're about to sing. Hark, the herald angels sing. Light and life to all he brings, risen with healing in his wings. Or is the song talking about Easter? Maybe it's both. Will you stand and sing?